A single night, a missing man, and a trail of secrets buried deep. Welcome to Silent Casebook. I am your host, Sterling. This community is incredible. Share in the comments where you're joining from. I always look forward to reading your messages. Let's step into the mystery. The morning the baker did not open his shop, Willow Creek felt strangely hollow, as if a piece of its daily rhythm had gone missing. The town was not used to surprises. Its life was measured in small, predictable movements. The church bell at 7, the low hum of barges on the river at 8, the faint smell of bread from Émile Fournier's bakery by past. This morning, the street felt unfinished. A mist clung to the stone facades, softening the sharp edges of shutters and lamp-posts. The cobblestones were wet from a night drizzle, and the air had that damp heaviness that made people walk with a kind of shrug, collars turned up. Old Madame Duret, who lived opposite the bakery, was the first to notice. She stood at her window, still in her nightdress, and peered out with a slight frown. Normally, by this hour, Émile would be arranging the fresh loaves in the front display. She liked to watch him in those quiet minutes before the first customers arrived. He worked with a steady rhythm, a man at peace with flour and routine. But today the shop's curtains were drawn. By 8, a small cluster had formed on the pavement, 2 men from the post office, the butcher's apprentice, and the schoolteacher on his way to class. They weren't alarmed. Willow Creek was not a place where alarm rose quickly, but they were unsettled. They spoke in low voices, as if the air itself had grown thinner. "Perhaps he's sick," said the schoolteacher. "Émile?" "He hasn't been sick a day in his life," said the butcher's boy. Someone tried the door. It was locked. By 9, a faint unease had spread to the cafe across the street. People took their usual tables, but their eyes kept flicking toward the bakery. Cups rattled more than usual against their saucers. Conversation lagged, interrupted by long silences that felt like held breath. Henri Lemaire noticed it from his usual spot by the window. He had retired from the police 2 years ago, after 35 years of quiet service in towns not so different from this one. His mornings were ritual, a slow walk down the lane, a coffee at the corner cafe, and the newspaper folded in thirds, though he often read the same lines twice without realizing. This morning, the newspaper lay untouched. He was not a man to involve himself in gossip, but he had learned long ago that the world speaks if you let it. People's faces said more than their words. And the faces in the cafe were uneasy. Not frightened, fright was too big a word for Willow Creek, but lightly bruised by uncertainty. Across the street, the bakery remained closed, curtains tight as a fist. A sparrow hopped along the edge of the gutter. A child, holding her mother's hand, paused to look at the shop with a puzzled expression, then was tugged along toward the school. By 10, Madame Fournier appeared at the side door of the bakery. She wore a faded house dress and no coat, though the air was damp. Her hair was pinned in a hasty knot, and her face was pale in a way that drew the eye. She did not look at the growing cluster of neighbors. Instead, she locked the side door with quick, jerky movements, then disappeared inside again. The group outside exchanged glances but said nothing. It was the kind of moment Henri Lemaire had learned to recognize, a small disruption that was larger than it appeared. Life in towns like this did not break suddenly. It unraveled in threads. A shutter left unlatched, a door left locked, a face that avoided the light. Around noon, the town's rhythms stumbled. Without the bakery open, the cafe ran out of fresh bread for its sandwiches. A delivery boy pedaled to the next village to fetch loaves, muttering under his breath. People went home with a faint sense of having been denied something essential. Lemaire took his lunch at his window, overlooking the square. A piece of cheese, a heel of yesterday's bread, and a single apple. He watched the bakery in the drizzle, watched Madame Fournier move briefly behind the curtains. Once she paused, hand against the glass, though her eyes were distant. The detective in him, the part he pretended to leave behind when he moved to Willow Creek, felt the first stirrings of curiosity. But curiosity, he reminded himself, was dangerous. Retired men with curiosity were like children poking at a hornet's nest. He had promised himself quiet in this town. He had chosen a place where the river moved slowly and where the world was content to let its shadows stay small. He had no business with missing bakers or restless neighbours. And yet, by mid-afternoon the first rumours began to ripple through the square. The grocer's assistant said he'd seen Monsieur Fournier walking near the river the previous evening, looking troubled. A man at the docks claimed he had left on a boat, though he couldn't say which or when. Someone whispered about a letter, though no one could say who had read it. Le Maire stepped outside into the grey light and felt the drizzle prick his face. He walked slowly across the square as if on an errand. His shoes splashed gently against wet cobblestones. He did not knock on the bakery door. He only paused for a moment, close enough to see the faint shadow of movement inside and close enough to smell the stale trace of flour that clung to the wood. Something had shifted in Willow Creek, and everyone felt it, though they could not name it. By evening, the rain had stopped, and the mist returned, rising from the river and curling around the street lamps. Madame Duret was still at her window, arms folded across her chest. The café had emptied. Dogs barked in the distance, uneasy, without knowing why. Le Maire stood by his own window and watched the street grow darker. He thought of the little moments he had shared with Émile Fournier. The nods in the morning, the brief conversations about the weather, the way the man weighed each loaf in his hand as if it were gold. A life could vanish quietly, he thought, not like in the city with police sirens and shouting, but in silence, like mist lifting off the river. He turned away from the window, but he felt the silence of the street pressing against his back. The first night of Émile Fournier's absence settled over Willow Creek with the weight of something unspoken. And in that silence, the town waited, though no one said what for. The morning after, Willow Creek wore the same mist as if nothing had changed. But to those who had felt the unease of the previous day, the quiet seemed thicker, carrying with it a weight of unspoken questions. Henri Le Maire woke early, though he had slept little. In his years on the force, he had learned that small mysteries gnaw at the mind in ways larger ones sometimes do not. They sit in the background, pulling at thought like a loose thread. He shaved slowly, listening to the occasional cartwheel on the cobblestones below his window. The bakery's window remained shuttered, the curtains drawn as tight as the day before. He noticed it without trying to. His eyes had a way of storing these details, even when he told himself he was not investigating anything. By 7, he made his way to the café, following his usual route along the river. He liked the smell of damp earth and the slow ripple of water against the stone embankment. It steadied him, reminded him that time moved the same whether a man disappeared or not. At the café, the air was warmer, heavy with coffee, and the faint tang of last night's tobacco. A few regulars were already there. Their voices were quieter than usual. When he entered, a couple of heads turned toward him, not for long, but enough to notice. "Morning, Le Maire," the proprietor said, placing a cup on the counter without asking. "Morning," he replied, settling into his usual seat by the window. Across the street, the bakery still looked lifeless. Madame Fournier had not appeared. 2 men from the post office were whispering near the back. One of them, a thin man with red hands from sorting mail in the cold, glanced at Le Maire, then lowered his voice further. Le Maire sipped his coffee and unfolded his newspaper, though he did not read it. He had learned that if he sat quietly enough, the world would eventually speak. And it did. The café door opened with a gust of damp air, and in stepped Madame Fournier. Her dress was neat but sombre, the colour of slate. Her hair, pinned carefully this time, could not hide the exhaustion on her face. The café fell briefly silent. She gave a polite nod to the proprietor and asked softly for a coffee to take away. Her hands trembled just enough to make the cup rattle on the saucer. You've heard nothing?" the proprietor asked carefully, almost against his will. She hesitated, her lips pressed together as if holding something in. "Nothing," she said finally. "He hasn't come home." Her voice was steady, but the words seemed to land heavily in the room. The men at the back exchanged a glance. Someone muttered something about the river. Madame Fournier's eyes flicked briefly toward Le Maire. It was not a request for help, nor a gesture of trust. It was simply a recognition. He was the man who saw things, the man who knew how to watch. She left with her coffee, walking quickly down the street, her figure disappearing into the fog. Le Maire stayed seated, listening to the slow return of voices. Someone mentioned the gendarmes in passing, but without conviction. In a town like Willow Creek, people preferred their mysteries to remain private, as if the outside world might bring more trouble than answers. By late morning, he found himself walking toward the small market square, telling himself it was for eggs and vegetables. The market was modest, a few stalls of apples, onions, carrots, and the occasional fish laid out on crushed ice. He paused at a stall where a farmer's wife was arranging leeks. "Strange about Fournier," she said, unprompted, her hands never stopping their work. Le Maire only made a low sound in his throat, somewhere between agreement and curiosity. "They say he argued with his brother last week," she continued, "at the warehouse, about money." Her eyes darted to his, searching for reaction. "People argue," Le Maire said mildly. "Yes, but he left without his coat. Someone saw him at dusk by the river. No coat, in this weather." She let the thought hang in the damp air. As he walked back to his apartment, Le Maire thought about the river. He had seen many rivers swallow many secrets, but this one was slow and reluctant, curling lazily through its stone banks. A body in that water would drift, not vanish. In the afternoon, he returned to his window overlooking the square. Madame Duret was there again at her own window, staring down at the bakery as if her gaze could conjure the missing man. 2 schoolboys passed, kicking a pebble along the street. When it clattered against the bakery door, they froze for a moment, then ran. He watched Madame Fournier emerge briefly to sweep her doorstep, her movements tight and purposeful. She paused once to glance up the street, not down, as if she was waiting for something that would not arrive from the direction of the river. The day stretched long and grey. Le Maire boiled a single potato for supper and ate it with a piece of cheese. He thought about the many disappearances he had encountered over the years. They were rarely dramatic. Most began like this: a locked door, a missing man, and a town that tried to continue breathing while holding its breath. In the evening, as he returned to the café, the conversation swelled just enough to catch fragments. Someone mentioned the police would come tomorrow if Fournier was still gone. Another swore he had seen a man boarding the evening train. The detective in Le Maire stirred again, but he reminded himself of the life he had chosen. He was only an observer now, a man of windows and walks. He did not knock on doors or ask questions. Not yet. When he returned to his apartment, the square was nearly empty. A single street lamp reflected off the wet stones, and the bakery stood like a sealed memory. He leaned on the windowsill, letting the cool night air touch his face. He realized, with a small private discomfort, that the absence of Émile Fournier had already begun to shape his days, and somewhere in the back of his mind a quiet question had taken root. The following morning, Willow Creek carried the same fog, but it felt heavier now, as if the air itself had learned to hesitate. Henri Lemaire rose before dawn, unable to sleep past the quiet pressure in his chest. He told himself he had no duty to this matter, yet each small sound in the early hours, the clatter of milk bottles, the distant whistle of the first train, seemed to whisper Fournier's absence. He brewed his coffee and drank it by the window. Across the square, the bakery door remained shut, its pale blue paint slick with moisture. He noticed a faint smear on the doorframe, a shadow of dirt, as though someone had gripped it with a wet hand. Perhaps it had always been there. Perhaps not. When the sun finally began to lift the fog, he took his usual walk toward the river. The air smelled of damp leaves and coal smoke. Children's voices echoed faintly from the alley behind the school, but otherwise the town was moving with the slow rhythm of caution. People glanced at each other longer than usual. Conversations began with a pause, as if they were first checking who might be listening. On the bridge, Lemaire leaned against the stone railing. He watched the water crawl past, carrying a single leaf in lazy circles near the support pillar. A man could stand here, thinking, smoking, wondering. A man could choose to turn toward the road, or the water. He thought of Fournier's missing coat, the one no one had seen him take. The river was not deep here, but deep enough. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Always the same river, eh? Lemaire turned. It was Bernard Fournier, the brother. His face was narrow and his coat worn at the elbows. He carried himself stiffly, like a man expecting judgment. "Morning," Lemaire said. Bernard came to stand beside him, staring down at the water. For a moment, they shared the silence, broken only by the soft churn of the current. "People are saying things," Bernard said finally. "They always do," Lemaire replied. Bernard's lips pressed tight. "They say he ran away, that he owed me money, that we fought. Half of it's true, but not the part they care about." Lemaire tilted his head slightly, waiting. "We argued," Bernard continued, "but we've argued for 20 years. That's what brothers do, and now—" He hesitated, his voice thinning. "Now they look at me as if I'd pushed him into the water myself." His hands gripped the stone railing. Lemaire noticed the faint tremor in his fingers, the way he glanced around before speaking, as if the empty square still might hear him. "Did he ever speak of leaving?" Lemaire asked. "Leaving?" Bernard gave a dry laugh. "He barely left the bakery. That was his whole life. Flour, dough, and that damned oven. He never wanted anything else." They stood in silence again. Lemaire studied Bernard's profile, the sharp jaw, the restless eye. There was something like guilt there, but not the kind that confessed to crime. It was the softer, more human kind, regret for the last words spoken, fear of the questions that linger when a man vanishes. "You think he's dead?" Bernard said suddenly. "I think he's gone," Lemaire answered. "How is different from why?" Bernard looked at him sharply, as though searching for accusation. But Lemaire's tone was calm, almost detached. He had learned that people reveal themselves in the space after a question when silence is allowed to breathe, Bernard muttered something about work and left, his shoes scraping against the damp stone steps that led back toward the warehouse. Le Maire watched him disappear into the fog that lingered in the alleys. Later that day, he visited the grocer. He needed nothing in particular, but shops were where stories hid. Inside, the smell of onions and dry wood filled the air. Madame Clement, who had been running the place since her husband's heart gave out, leaned on the counter, her hands clasped loosely. "You've heard, of course," she said, before he could speak. "I've heard," he said. "I saw Madame Fournier yesterday evening," she continued. "She came in for milk. She looked, I don't know, not surprised, but emptied, like she was waiting for this." Le Maire paused, pretending to examine the small pile of apples by the register. "Waiting?" Madame Clement shrugged. "I've lived long enough to know when a woman carries a shadow, and she's carried one for years. I thought it was the bakery, those hours, that heat. But now—" She let the thought trail off into the dusty light that slanted through the window. Le Maire paid for 2 apples and thanked her. Outside, he peeled one with his pocket-knife as he walked. The skin curled into a single ribbon, and he thought about Madame Fournier's silence, the way she had accepted the gossip without denial. There was a difference between fear and resignation. She had shown the latter. By afternoon, he found himself wandering toward the bakery. He didn't knock or enter. He simply stood across the street watching the drawn curtains, the little pot of geraniums by the door, leaves speckled with the last of the morning rain. He thought of the empty bed inside, the unlit oven, the smell of flour settling into the walls. Then, almost without sound, the door opened a few inches. Madame Fournier's face appeared in the gap. She saw him at once. "Inspector," she said softly, though he had retired years ago. "Madame," he acknowledged. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but her voice held steady. "They all want to know where he is. They all think I know." "Do you?" Le Maire asked gently. Her gaze shifted past him, to the river road. "I know he was tired," she said finally. "But he was always tired. That's the life he chose. I asked him once if he was happy. He said, 'Happiness isn't for people like us.'" She hesitated, then shut the door, without another word. Le Maire stood there a moment longer, feeling the echo of her voice. He thought of all the lives he had watched from windows and thresholds, lives that carried the weight of quiet despair. Sometimes people vanished because the world asked too much of them. Sometimes because it asked nothing at all. That night, he sat by his window again. Across the square, the light in the bakery kitchen flickered once and went out. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then stopped abruptly, as if reminded of the hush that had settled over Willow Creek. The detective felt no closer to answers, but he understood the town better now. Every house carried a shadow, and behind one of them, the truth waited in silence. The next day, in Willow Creek, dawned without color. The sky was a pale sheet, and the air had that hollow stillness that comes after too many whispered conversations. Henri Le Maire left his apartment late in the morning. He had spent hours sitting at his small table, drinking coffee that had long gone cold, watching the square through a thin curtain of fog. The bakery remained closed. He noticed how the absence of its morning scents, yeast, warm crust, the faint sweetness of pastry, made the square feel incomplete, as if the heart of the town had paused. He strolled without purpose, hands in the pockets of his overcoat. He told himself he was simply an old man with a habit of walking, not a detective on a case. Retirement had taught him the value of pretending disinterest. People offered more to a quiet listener than to a man who looked like he wanted answers. On the corner, near the post office, he encountered young Clara Marchand. She was carrying a wicker basket of laundry and startled slightly at seeing him. Her eyes darted toward the bakery before returning to his face. "Morning, mademoiselle," he said softly. She nodded, adjusting the weight of her basket. "Morning, Monsieur le Maire." "You've been to the river?" he asked. No, just to the washroom behind the school," she replied quickly. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the basket cloth. A line of damp hair clung to her temple. Le Maire noticed the small signs of tension, the shallow breathing, the reluctance to hold his gaze. "You knew Fournier well?" he asked, letting his tone fall somewhere between casual and curious. She hesitated. "Everyone knows everyone here?" "That's true." He waited a beat. "But some people know more than others." Her lips parted, then closed again. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "He was kind," she said finally. "Quiet. He gave me stale bread for my chicken sometimes, and he listened when no one else did." Le Maire tilted his head slightly. "Listened?" A faint flush rose in her cheeks. "Oh, nothing. I just mean—" He was gentle. She glanced toward the square, then whispered, "They're all saying things? About his brother? About me?" The words trembled in the air, half confession, half defense. "People talk when they're afraid," Le Maire said, his voice calm. Clara's eyes softened in something like gratitude, but she said nothing more. She continued on her way, and he let her go, filing the conversation into that quiet corner of his mind where fragments of human truth collected like dust motes. That afternoon, Le Maire chose the café as his observation post. It wasn't busy. Midweek afternoons rarely were. The interior smelled faintly of old coffee grounds and polish, the kind of scent that never quite left the wood. He ordered nothing but a black coffee and settled by the window. The square lay before him like a stage. He watched as two men, both workers from the sawmill, paused outside the shuttered bakery. One leaned toward the other, muttered something, and both laughed in a way that was sharp, almost cruel. When the café door opened with a soft chime, Le Maire turned slightly and saw Madame Fournier enter. Her steps were careful, as though she were walking into a room where she didn't belong. She chose a table in the corner and kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Le Maire rose and approached her, with the slow courtesy of age. "May I sit, madame?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." He sat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The café seemed to dim around them, though the air was bright with noon light. "You've seen the way they look at me," she said at last, her voice a whisper. "Yes," Le Maire said, "and I've seen the way you look at them." Her eyes lifted to his. They were pale and rimmed with exhaustion. "Do you think I know where he is?" "I think you know more than you say," he replied evenly. A pause. Her fingers toyed with the edge of a folded handkerchief. "He wasn't a bad man," she said finally, "but he carried heaviness, the kind that seeps into a house, into your bones. Some nights he would sit at the table long after dinner, staring at his hands. He said little, but I could hear it, the weight of all the years he didn't live." "You were afraid of him?" "No," she said quickly, almost sharply. "Not afraid, just tired." The word hung in the air like steam over cooling coffee. Le Maire leaned back, letting the silence grow until it pressed between them. He had learned that truth did not always need to be pulled. Sometimes it seeped through the cracks in a person's restraint. Madame Fournier blinked slowly, then murmured, "The night before he disappeared, he went out late." He said he wanted air. I thought nothing of it. He never came back. Did he take anything? She hesitated. Only his shoes. No coat, no bag, no preparation for a journey, a man who left only to leave. Thank you, madame, Le Maire said gently. Sometimes saying a thing aloud makes it easier to carry. Her shoulders relaxed by a fraction. He stood, left her with her quiet coffee, and returned to his window table. Evening fell with a dim, amber glow that smudged the corners of the town. Le Maire walked the river path again. Along the embankment, the stones were slick with moss. He saw the silhouette of Bernard Fournier sitting on a crate, smoking, his face lit briefly with each flicker of the cigarette. "You walk a lot," Bernard said without turning. "It helps me think," Le Maire replied. "What's there to think about?" "People," the old detective said simply. Bernard exhaled smoke toward the river. "People are worse than rivers. Rivers at least move on." The words had a quiet bitterness to them, the kind that comes from years of swallowing regret. Le Maire left him to the water and the silence, knowing some truths didn't surface under direct questioning. When he returned home that night, the square was empty. A single cat crossed between the lamp-post and the shuttered bakery. The silence of Willow Creek pressed like a damp cloth against the windows. In the stillness, Le Maire felt the shape of the truth, not yet visible, but close. He had seen enough to know that the vanishing of Jean Fournier was not only an act of disappearance, but also a reflection of lives quietly breaking under the weight of themselves. Somewhere, in the pauses and the glances, the reason was waiting. Morning in Willow Creek arrived with a soft drizzle that blurred the outlines of the square. Henri Le Maire sat by his window, watching the mist slide down the glass, listening to the muted sounds of a town moving as though underwater. Rain always softened the world, and in that softening small truths sometimes rose to the surface. The bakery remained shuttered. Its absence had become a presence of its own, like a missing tooth in a smile everyone had learned to avoid. A delivery cart slowed in front of it, hesitated, then rolled on without stopping. By late morning, Le Maire decided to take his walk. His body had learned these streets long ago. He knew which cobblestones would hold water, which gutters filled first. The drizzle had settled into a fine mist that clung to his coat, and the town seemed quieter than usual. He passed the café and saw only two people inside. Madame Fournier at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from, and Father Morel, the parish priest, who stared at a newspaper without turning a page. Le Maire entered. The bell gave its soft, lonely chime. Madame Fournier's eyes lifted to him briefly before sliding to the window. He ordered a coffee and chose the table nearest to hers, not to intrude, but to exist nearby like a calm presence. He had learned that grief and guilt sometimes loosened when it wasn't directly confronted. The priest folded his newspaper and said, "The town is restless." "They're afraid of what they can't name," Le Maire said. Father Morel nodded, his fingers tightening on the paper. "People fear emptiness more than they fear death. A missing man leaves a hole everyone wants to fill with something." As if on cue, Madame Fournier exhaled a trembling sigh. "They whisper outside my door," she said softly. Le Maire turned his head slightly toward her. "Whispering is easier than asking." She didn't look at him, only traced a circle on the table with her fingertip. "They think I know something, that I sent him away, or worse." The priest spoke gently. Jean Fournier was a complicated man. People will imagine what they need to feel safe. "Safe?" She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "They just want to feel better than us." Le Maire sipped his coffee. Through the window he saw Bernard Fournier cross the square, head down, shoulders hunched against a drizzle that had turned to thin rain. He didn't enter the café. He passed like a shadow, vanishing toward the sawmill path. Later that afternoon, Lemaire walked the riverbank again. Rain had deepened the smell of wet earth and moss. He paused near the willow tree that bent over the water like a figure in prayer. The river carried small branches and leaves, its surface rippling with the slow persistence of time. He heard footsteps and turned to see old Madame Roche approaching with her shopping bag. Her eyes were red, though she wasn't crying now. "Monsieur le Maire," she greeted him, voice trembling with both age and unease. "Madame," he said softly. She hesitated before speaking again. "I dreamt of him last night." Le Maire didn't ask who. He simply waited. "Jean Fournier," she whispered. "I saw him standing in my garden, in the rain. He said nothing, just looked at me, and then he was gone." "It was only a dream," Le Maire said gently. "Maybe," she said, clutching her bag. "But when I woke, I felt as if he had been there, as if he wanted something from me." Le Maire inclined his head. "Sometimes the dead visit the living before they are buried." She shivered, though the air wasn't cold. "I saw him once, a week before he disappeared. He stood in the square after dark. Just stood there, staring at the bakery window as if it was a mirror. I almost called to him, but there was something in his face, like a man who had already left." "Thank you, madame," Le Maire said. "Dreams and memories sometimes hold the same weight." She nodded, grateful to have said it aloud, and shuffled away toward her house. That evening, Le Maire found himself walking to the sawmill path. A soft fog had crept in, muffling the world. He could smell damp wood and river mud. Ahead, Bernard sat on the same crate he had used the night before, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. "You come here often," Le Maire said. Bernard glanced at him without surprise. "It's quiet here. People leave me alone." "They talk about you when you're not here." "They talk no matter where I am." He flicked ash into the river. "They think I hated him. Maybe I did. But hate is like smoke. You breathe it in yourself first." Le Maire didn't reply. He only watched the smoke drift and dissolve into the fog. Bernard continued after a pause. He wasn't made for living like this. Work, eat, sleep. He carried too many things inside. I could see it. Some nights I thought he might just walk out into the night and never come back. I guess he finally did. "You sound as if you understand him," Le Maire said. "I understood the part that wanted to leave," Bernard muttered. "The part that makes you stare at the water and think about stepping in, not because you want to die, but because you want the silence." His words carried no theatrics, only the calm heaviness of a man who had thought too long about quiet endings. Le Maire stayed with him in silence until the cigarette burned down to its last inch. When Bernard rose to leave, his coat was soaked through with mist, and his face carried the blank expression of someone living with a weight that couldn't be shared. Back in his apartment, Le Maire sat at his table, the room dim except for the street lamp glow through the rain-streaked window. He wrote nothing down. He rarely did. He preferred to let the fragments live in his mind until they aligned into something resembling truth. The town was starting to feel haunted, not by a ghost in the traditional sense, but by the emotional imprint of a man who could not carry his own life anymore. Every silence, every whisper, every nervous glance seemed to carry the echo of Jean Fournier's absence. Le Maire knew that the real answers were never in missing footprints or river currents. They lived in the quiet desperation of the people left behind. The next morning, the rain had lifted, leaving the streets washed and glistening. A thin light slipped through the clouds, illuminating the puddles in the square like dull mirrors. Henri Lemaire walked early, before the bakery's shutters even stirred. He had slept little. Dreams of water and silence had followed him through the night. In the square, a group of children played around the dry fountain, their voices echoing against the stone facades. The town seemed to inhale slowly after days of damp unease. Yet the bakery remained shut, its wooden door streaked with rain stains, and its small window reflecting only the empty street. Lemaire noticed movement behind the glass, a flicker, like someone passing through the shadows. He hesitated, then approached the door and knocked once. A moment passed before the lock turned. Bernard Fournier stood there, his eyes bleary, hair dishevelled. He seemed older than the last time Lemaire had seen him, as if the past few days had carved deeper lines into his face. "What is it?" Bernard asked, voice rough. "I was passing," Lemaire said calmly. "I thought to see how you were." Bernard glanced behind him into the dim bakery before replying, "We're fine." But the word "we" caught Lemaire's ear. He leaned slightly to the side, and through the narrow gap he caught a glimpse of Madame Fournier at the back of the shop, sitting on a stool, her head bent into her hands. The room smelled of damp flour and unwashed dishes. "You're not baking today?" "Not today, maybe tomorrow." Bernard's hand tightened on the door, as though he might close it at any second. "I understand," Lemaire said. "Some days the town feels heavier than others." Bernard studied him with a wary look, then muttered, "We need time." Before Lemaire could respond, the door closed gently but firmly. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed in the quiet street. He lingered outside for a moment, listening to the faintest sound of movement behind the wood, a soft murmur of voices, then silence. The bakery had become a sealed chamber of grief, a place where the air itself seemed reluctant to move. As he walked away, Lemaire considered the many kinds of doors people closed, not just the wooden ones. Some were made of silence, of tight smiles, and averted glances, and some doors, once shut, did not open again for years. He spent the afternoon visiting the edges of the town, where gardens ran into wet fields, and fences sagged under the weight of years. At the edge of the Fournier property, he saw the narrow side path leading to their back kitchen door. It, too, was closed, the curtains drawn tightly. Across the lane, Madame Roche was sweeping her porch with deliberate strokes, though the ground was already clean. "They don't want to see anyone," she said as Lemaire approached, without waiting for him to ask. "I tried to bring them bread yesterday." Bernard opened the door just wide enough to say thank you, then shut it, like he was hiding something. "Maybe he's just tired," Lemaire said. "Or ashamed." She hesitated, resting the broom handle against her shoulder. "My mother used to say that when a man goes missing, he leaves behind his shadow in the house. It makes people nervous. It makes them hide." Lemaire gave a small nod, acknowledging the weight of the superstition without dismissing it. Later that day, he returned to the cafe. The bell chimed softly as he entered, and the scent of stale coffee greeted him. Two farmers were talking in low voices near the counter. "Said he saw Bernard down by the river again last night," one of them murmured. "Looking for him?" the other asked. "Or making sure he stays gone," the first replied, voice heavy with suggestion. When they noticed Lemaire, the conversation died like a candle in the wind. He took a seat near the window and ordered coffee from Lucien, the owner, who wiped his hands nervously on his apron. "They've locked themselves away," Lucien said in a low tone. "Won't answer the priest, won't answer the neighbours. I hear Madame Fournier hasn't stepped outside since Sunday." "Some doors close because they must," Le Maire said. "Others close because people fear what's outside." Lucien glanced at the farmers and then leaned closer. "And some doors close because of what's inside." The days grew longer in their slowness. In the evenings, Le Maire would see a single light burning in the bakery's upstairs window. No smell of bread drifted into the street, no laughter or footsteps spilled from the door. On the third evening, he decided to walk past again. This time he paused at the river bend before returning to the square. The air was cool and damp, the water carrying the last fragments of sunset like broken glass. When he reached the bakery, he saw the front door slightly ajar for the first time in days. A thin shaft of light cut across the threshold. He hesitated before knocking gently. Bernard appeared, his face pale in the lamplight. He didn't speak, only opened the door wider. Inside, the shop was dim. Flour dust coated the counters, untouched. A single loaf of bread sat on the shelf, hard as stone. Madame Fournier was at the table, staring at nothing, her face hollow. A teacup trembled in her hand, though she wasn't drinking. Le Maire stepped inside quietly. "This house feels heavy," he said softly. Bernard didn't answer. He sat across from his mother, elbows on the table, and for a moment Le Maire thought he might speak. But he only exhaled, a long, exhausted sound. Finally, Madame Fournier whispered, "We can't sleep. At night, we hear him." "Hear him?" Le Maire asked, though his tone carried no alarm. "Footsteps on the stairs," she said. "The sound of the back door, the one that creaks. Sometimes I think he'll come in, covered in rain, smelling of the river. Sometimes I want him to. Sometimes I don't." Her voice broke, and she pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes. Bernard reached out, but his hand stopped in the air before touching her. Le Maire stood in the small kitchen, absorbing the silence that followed. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the silence of something withheld. When he left the bakery, he knew the door would be closed again by morning. He also knew that behind that wood and glass, something was unraveling quietly. Something the town would not see until it was too late. And as he walked home under the pale street lamp light, he realized that the missing man wasn't the only ghost haunting Willow Creek. It was the living who carried the heaviest shadows. The town had a way of deciding things long before the police did. By the end of the week, whispers had gathered like autumn leaves in the square. They scraped against one another in the wind, circling the same name, though no one spoke it directly to the gendarme. It began at the café. Henri Le Maire sat by the window, the familiar chipped saucer beneath his cup, and listened without leaning in. Farmers had come early that morning, muddy boots leaving streaks on the tile floor. They spoke in low tones at the counter. Bernard was seen again by the river. Always at night, isn't it? Always alone. Lucien, the owner, wiped glasses with a cloth that had lost its whiteness years ago. He didn't add to the conversation, but his eyes flicked toward Le Maire once, as though to see if he was listening. The detective pretended to study the condensation running down the window. He had learned long ago that in towns like Willow Creek, the river of truth ran through gossip first, and it carried all manner of debris. By midday, the sky had darkened again, the light pale and sharp, like a knife sliding along the surface of water. Le Maire walked along the main street and found Madame Roche on her porch, peeling potatoes into a metal bowl. "You hear what they're saying?" she asked, before he had even greeted her. I hear many things, Lemaire said. She tossed a peel into the bowl, wet and curling. I saw him 2 nights ago standing by the old mill, not moving, just staring at the water. Bernard? She nodded. I called out, but he didn't answer. He just walked away into the dark, like a shadow. Lemaire considered this quietly. Bernard Fournier had the kind of face that carried its own weather, eyes shadowed, mouth set as if against wind. To see him alone by the river didn't surprise him. What mattered more was how the town had already shaped that image into guilt. And that evening, he passed the bakery. Its door was locked, as always, but a faint glow showed in the upstairs window. For a moment he thought he saw a figure against the glass, then nothing. A man approached from the side street. Gaston, the butcher's assistant, barely 20, and always eager to share what he knew. They say Bernard's the one, Gaston whispered, glancing at the darkened shop. The one what? The one who, you know, made him disappear. Lemaire watched the boy's face carefully. Who told you that? Everyone, Gaston said with a shrug. Even my mother says it. Why else would he be out there every night staring at the water? Why else hide in that bakery like a rat? The detective said nothing. In towns like this, a man's solitude could be mistaken for a confession. And the next morning, Lemaire visited the Fournier house, this time through the narrow side path that smelled faintly of damp earth. He knocked on the back door. Bernard answered after a long pause, his shirt wrinkled, his jaw rough with days of stubble. "You've come to accuse me too?" Bernard said, voice flat. "No," Lemaire said simply. "I've come for coffee, if you'll make some." Bernard hesitated, then stepped aside. The kitchen was colder than it should have been, the stove unlit. Madame Fournier sat at the table, staring at a loaf of bread that looked like it had hardened overnight. "You've heard them," Bernard said, filling the pot with water. "They think I killed him." "I've heard the whispers," Lemaire admitted. "I haven't heard the truth." Bernard slammed the pot onto the stove harder than necessary. "What truth? That he left because he wanted to? That he hated this place, hated the bakery, hated everything about us?" Madame Fournier flinched at the words but said nothing. Lemaire leaned against the wall, letting the silence settle. He watched the steam rise slowly from the spout. Sometimes the way a man boiled water told more than his words. Finally Bernard muttered, "He was my friend. I went to the river because I thought maybe he'd come back that way, that I'd see him. Alive." "And if you didn't?" Lemaire asked. Bernard's hand tightened on the counter. He didn't answer. When Lemaire left, the town felt smaller, its streets bending inward like a closing fist. He wandered past the square and paused by the gendarmerie. Through the window he saw the constable reading a newspaper, his face slack with disinterest. The law here followed the rhythm of the town, slow, reluctant, and easily swayed by rumour. By afternoon, the whispers had sharpened into a single, unspoken verdict. Children were told not to play near the bakery. Neighbours crossed the street rather than pass the door. A dog left a dead bird on the Fournier step, and some swore it was a sign. And that evening, the detective sat by the river, where willows trailed their fingers in the water. The air smelled of wet leaves and distant smoke. He thought of Bernard standing here alone, staring at the dark current. The river did not accuse anyone, it simply carried reflections. The next day, he overheard a different tone in the cafe. "They'll never prove it," one man said, "but we know." "They always break in the end," another replied. "A man can't hide from his own guilt forever." Lemaire stirred his coffee, eyes on the curling steam. He understood the town's need for a suspect, for a story they could carry home like warm bread. Without one, the unease would settle over them all, and no one could sleep. That night, he returned to his modest flat above the post office. He opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence. "The town has chosen its ghost." He underlined it once, then closed the book. In Willow Creek, guilt didn't need evidence, it only needed silence, and Bernard Fournier had given them plenty. Le Maire awoke to the sound of rain against the window pane, soft and irregular, like fingers testing a piano. He sat for a while at the edge of his narrow bed, listening to the distant hum of the town slowly waking beneath the grey sky. The air carried the smell of damp stone and something faintly metallic from the river. He dressed without hurry and lit the small stove, the blue flame flickering in the half-light of the room. For a few minutes he simply watched the kettle before it whistled, the rising steam curling as though reluctant to leave the spout. These quiet moments were what he relied on most. They gave shape to thoughts that had no words yet. The town square was empty except for a milk cart and two boys chasing each other around the fountain, their laughter oddly thin in the wet air. Le Maire crossed the street and paused by the bakery. Its shutters were closed as usual. Water dripped from the wooden awning in slow, deliberate drops. He imagined Bernard inside, moving from table to table, pretending to tidy the place but never quite finishing. Solitude left marks on a man that no one but an attentive eye could read. By mid-morning, Le Maire found himself in the café again, seated at the same corner table. Lucien slid his coffee toward him with a nod, no words exchanged. Across the room, Madame Roche spoke softly to a neighbor. "She says he won't even look her in the eye," the neighbor whispered. "Guilt shows in the eyes," Madame Roche replied, pursing her lips. Le Maire stirred his coffee slowly. He watched the ripples settle, mirroring the room in miniature. No one seemed to notice him, yet he felt every gesture. The way Madame Roche's hands trembled slightly when she lifted her cup. The neighbor's eyes flicking to the door, as if fearful Bernard might appear. Lucien's quiet habit of polishing the same glass over and over, not for cleanliness, but as a shield against conversation. It was always in the small movements, the pauses and hesitations, that truth leaked out. After the café, Le Maire walked through the wet streets, stopping to watch a man unload crates of apples. Across from him, the constable stood under the gendarmerie awning, reading a newspaper that had gone soft in the rain. "Any news?" Le Maire asked, stepping closer. The constable shook his head. "Nothing, just more talk." "You believe it?" The constable folded the paper, avoiding his gaze. "I believe people need someone to blame. That's all." There was no bitterness in his voice, only resignation. And that afternoon, Le Maire walked the footpath along the river. The willows hung lower now, their thin branches dripping into the current. He paused where the mill's shadow stretched across the water, the place Bernard had been seen standing alone. The river offered no reflection of guilt or innocence. It simply carried fragments of the sky and the occasional leaf, spinning in circles before being taken downstream. He crouched, tracing a fingertip across the damp wood of the old railing. A man could stare at this water for hours, thinking he might find an answer in its silence. Back in town, the rhythm of daily life tried to assert itself. A postman delivered letters under his umbrella, nodding to Le Maire as he passed. A girl in a yellow coat pressed her face against the window of the bakery, as if expecting pastries that no longer appeared. Lemaire noticed the girl's mother tug her gently away, casting a glance toward the closed door. Fear had a way of spreading, even to those too young to understand its shape. Well, that evening, he decided to visit Bernard again. The back path to the Fournier house was muddy from the rain. He knocked lightly, and this time Madame Fournier opened the door. Her face was pale, lips pressed thin. "He's not well," she said quietly. Lemaire stepped inside. Bernard sat at the table, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the wood grain as if it held him in place. A half-eaten piece of bread lay on the plate before him, untouched since morning. "You've been walking by the river?" Lemaire said softly, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Bernard nodded slowly. "I keep thinking he'll come back that way. I don't know why." "You're not sleeping?" Another nod. Madame Fournier hovered by the stove, hands twisting the corner of her apron. Lemaire watched her a moment longer than necessary, noticing the way her eyes avoided her husband entirely. Guilt did not only belong to the accused. When Lemaire left, night had settled over the town like a soft blanket. Lamps flickered in a few windows, casting yellow pools onto the slick cobblestones. He walked back to his small room above the post office and opened his notebook. He wrote in his careful script, "The river reflects nothing, but the town sees only what it wants to see." The next morning, he lingered at his window, watching the street below. Bernard did not appear. The square was quieter than usual, as if the rain had washed some of the energy out of people. From this quiet distance, he began to notice the town itself as a living thing. Its eyes were the windows, its whispers the smoke curling from chimneys. It waited, patient and heavy, for someone to break under its gaze. And Bernard, inside his shuttered bakery, seemed to be carrying all that weight, alone. Lemaire wondered, not for the first time, if the man's guilt or innocence mattered less to the town than the relief of having a suspect. As evening approached, he returned to the river for the last time that day. The current had quickened from the rain, carrying twigs and leaves past him. He watched until the sky darkened and the lamps came on one by one across the square. He didn't need to ask questions anymore. He only had to wait. The truth, he knew, would arrive in gestures and silences long before it arrived in words. The rain had stopped, leaving the town in a damp stillness. Puddles reflected the pale morning light, fractured by the occasional ripple of a passing bird. Lemaire walked the cobbled street slowly, his hands in his pockets, his shoes leaving dark prints that faded behind him. The bakery was still shuttered. He paused there for a long moment, listening to the muted sounds within. A single cough drifted through the wood. He moved on, leaving the scent of cold flour and absence behind. At the post office, the clerk handed him a letter. "It came last night," the clerk said, lowering his voice, "for Bernard Fournier." The envelope was plain, the handwriting awkward and uneven. It had been posted from a nearby town. Lemaire ran his finger over the crease but said nothing. He delivered the letter himself. When Bernard opened the door, his face seemed thinner than the day before, as if the night had stripped him of something. "A letter for you," Lemaire said simply. Bernard hesitated before taking it, his hand trembling, almost imperceptibly. His wife appeared behind him, a dish towel clutched in her hands. Her eyes flicked to the letter, then to Lemaire, and away again. "Thank you," Bernard murmured, and he shut the door with unusual care. Lemaire returned to the café and waited. He drank his coffee slowly, his gaze drifting over the room without ever settling. By late morning, Bernard appeared, His steps were heavy, his hair damp as though he had bathed in cold water, but found no warmth in it. He sat across from Lemaire without being invited. "I need to talk to someone," Bernard said, voice low. "You already are," Lemaire replied. Bernard's fingers tapped the edge of the table, leaving faint flour smudges. "It's not just about that night," he began. "There's something I should have told you. Or someone." He paused, swallowing. "I owed money. Not a lot, but enough to make a man restless. Jules knew. He said he'd help me, but he never did." Lemaire watched the man's face carefully. The words were not yet the confession he seemed to be carrying. "You didn't tell anyone else?" Bernard shook his head. "If the town knew, they'd see it as a reason for anything." His voice cracked. He wiped his palms on his trousers, leaving faint, white streaks. That afternoon, Lemaire walked to the edge of town, to the row of narrow houses by the old tannery. He knocked on a door where the paint had long since peeled away. A woman opened it, her eyes sharp and dark against the grey light. "You're looking for my brother?" she said, before he spoke. He nodded. "He's gone, took the bicycle and left before dawn." "Where would he go?" She shrugged. "Where he always goes when things get heavy. The river first, then somewhere no one can follow." Her words were calm, almost rehearsed. Lemaire studied her face, the tension around the mouth, the faint twitch in her left eyelid. People who told half-truths often betrayed themselves in tiny muscles. "Did he leave anything behind?" Lemaire asked. The woman hesitated, then stepped aside. On the table lay a folded sheet of paper. It was blank. "He does that," she muttered. "Leaves paper with nothing on it. Says it makes him feel like he's said what he needed to." Lemaire picked up the paper, turned it over, and set it down again. By evening, the town's gossip had shifted. A cyclist was seen on the road to Saint-Périn, a man with hunched shoulders and no luggage. People whispered that he was running. Others said he had gone to fetch help, or to disappear for good. Lemaire walked the streets as the lamps flickered to life. Through windows he caught glimpses of families at supper. Forks paused mid-air when his shadow passed. The town had learned to measure itself against his footsteps. Later, he returned to the river. It was quieter than the day before, its surface broken only by a drifting branch. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke from the chimneys. He thought of the letter in Bernard's hands, the blank paper on the table, the man on the bicycle. Threads moved through the town like currents beneath the water, unseen but insistent. He crouched by the railing, watching the reflection of the lamps shimmer on the dark surface. He could almost feel the weight of the secrets pressing against the water, waiting for release. Near midnight, a knock came at his door. Lemaire opened it to find Bernard standing there, soaked through from the misting rain. "I read it again," Bernard whispered. I think he's telling me to leave." Lemaire said nothing, only motioned for him to sit. "He knows about the money," Bernard continued, voice breaking. "He knows I can't pay it back now that the bakery is closed. He says he'll make it right, but I have to disappear first." "And will you?" Bernard pressed his hands together as if in prayer. "I don't know. I keep thinking if I leave, it will only prove them right." Lemaire watched him in silence. The man's struggle was not with the law, but with the eyes of the town. When Bernard left, the room felt heavier. Lemaire sat at his small desk and wrote in his notebook, "There are 2 disappearances now, one in the river and one in the heart of a man who cannot stay." He closed the book and blew out the lamp. In the darkness, he listened to the town breathe, each secret curling like smoke in the night. The following morning broke in a dull haze. The river mist clung to the streets, softening edges and swallowing the sound of early footsteps. Le Maire opened his shutters to the grey day and listened. The town seemed to be holding its breath. He made his way to the cafe where the owner was sweeping sawdust across the floor. A single customer, old Marius with his crooked cap, nursed a black coffee by the window. He glanced up at Le Maire and quickly looked away, as if eye contact might pull him into a conversation he was not ready for. The coffee was bitter, and the warmth did little to soften the tension in the room. There was a quiet understanding spreading through the town. Bernard was crumbling, and everyone could feel it. By midday, Le Maire walked to the bakery. It had been closed for 3 days now. On the door, someone had left a small paper bag, a loaf of bread inside, still warm, a quiet act of pity, or maybe guilt. He knocked. After a long pause, Bernard's wife opened the door. Her hair was loose, uncombed, and her eyes had that distant, brittle shine of someone who had not slept properly in days. "Is he here?" Le Maire asked softly. She nodded and stepped aside. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt sugar. Bernard sat at the table, slumped forward, staring at a cold cup of coffee. He looked up only briefly. "Sterling," he said, using the detective's first name for the first time. His voice was hoarse, almost boyish. "I can't stand it anymore. They're all looking at me like I did it. Even if I leave, I'll still carry their eyes." He rubbed his temples with flour-stained fingers. His wife busied herself at the counter, pretending to wash an already clean plate. The silences in that kitchen were heavier than any accusation. Le Maire didn't push him. He knew that pressing too hard would only close Bernard up again. Instead, he took the seat across from him and studied the man's face. There were cracks now, subtle lines of exhaustion that went beyond fatigue. "What does the letter say when you read it now?" Le Maire asked finally. Bernard hesitated. "It doesn't matter what it says. It's what it means. He's telling me to vanish, to let him, or someone, clean up this mess. He's telling me that if I stay, things will get worse." "Worse how?" Bernard shook his head. His wife stopped the pointless scrubbing and gripped the edge of the counter. She didn't speak, but her shoulders trembled faintly. Outside, the street was alive with whispers. A boy ran past with a folded newspaper. Le Maire caught the headline, "Baker's shop remains shut as speculation grows." It wasn't an accusation, but in a small town, it was enough. At the cafe later, Marius spoke softly to a pair of men at the counter. "He won't last the week," he said. "Either he'll run or, well..." He trailed off, making a small gesture with his thumb across his neck. Le Maire sipped his second coffee, eyes on the street, letting the words settle in the air like dust. Rumours had become a form of punishment, and the town was the executioner. That evening, Le Maire returned to the river. He walked the banks, hands behind his back. Damp leaves clung to his shoes. He thought about the blank paper on the table of the old house, the letter that had broken Bernard's composure, and the bicycle vanishing down the road. He imagined the river as a ledger. Everything that weighed on these people eventually found its way here, dissolved into the slow, patient current. When he returned to his room above the post office, he found a folded note slipped under his door. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged. "If I go, it's because I cannot stay. Forgive me for leaving things undone." It wasn't signed, but he knew. The next morning, the bakery door was wide open. Inside, flour dust floated in a stray beam of light, but the counters were bare. On the table lay Bernard's apron, neatly folded. His wife sat in the corner chair, staring at the empty space as if trying to fill it with her mind. "He left before sunrise?" she whispered. Her voice was hollow, stripped of accusation or hope. "Didn't even take the good shoes." Le Maire stepped in quietly. The room felt like a stage after a play had ended, props and shadows the only things remaining. "Did he leave a note for you?" She shook her head. By noon, the whole town knew. Some shook their heads with pity. Others muttered that they had expected this. The absence of Bernard became heavier than his presence ever was. Silence had turned into judgment. At the café, Marius tried to talk to Le Maire again. "Don't you think he's guilty, Sterling?" "A man doesn't leave unless he's guilty." Le Maire didn't answer. He stared at the steam rising from his cup, then at the street where a young boy pressed his nose to the bakery window, seeing only emptiness. He thought about the weight of moral pressure, how it didn't need a courtroom or a gavel. The town itself had become the trial, and Bernard had lost the will to defend himself. That night, rain returned, soft and persistent. Le Maire wrote in his notebook before bed, "The town has learned to push without touching. Shame is a heavier hand than any law." He closed the book and listened to the sound of water trickling from the gutters. Somewhere in that sound, he imagined Bernard's footsteps fading, his absence growing louder than any confession. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the town washed in a damp, uneasy calm. Puddles glimmered in the way, uneven stones of the square, and the bakery's open doorway gaped like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. Le Maire walked past it on his way to the post office. A cat was curled on the window-sill, tail flicking lazily, unaware of the human absence behind the glass. He paused, staring into the empty shop. The absence had a shape now, the shape of Bernard, hollowed out and missing. He pushed on, his footsteps soft against the wet ground. The townspeople were quieter than usual, but the quiet carried a sharper edge. At the café, 3 men huddled near the stove. Their voices were low but not soft enough to hide their meaning. "They say he took the night train," one murmured. "No," another corrected. "He went by river path. His wife said so. Man like that wouldn't go far. Not with all that weight on him." A short laugh, humourless. "Weight's what sinks you, not what drives you." Le Maire stirred his coffee, listening without moving his eyes from the dark liquid. He thought of Bernard's last note, the smudged ink, the words, "cannot stay." It was the sort of thing a man wrote not when he fled towards something, but when he fled away from everything. The day passed in slow movements. A cart rattled over the stones, a door slammed in the distance, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Even the postmaster avoided conversation. Around dusk, Le Maire walked the river path. The ground was soft, giving under his shoes, leaving clear impressions. He imagined Bernard walking here, the night pressing close, the water carrying the same dull reflections it did now. He found a cigarette butt near the bridge, soaked and half muddied. Bernard smoked only when nervous. His wife had said so once. The next morning, a commotion woke the town before sunrise. A boy ran shouting through the square, his voice cracking with the thrill of knowing first. "By the mill! They found him by the mill!" People emerged from doorways in their coats and scarves, blinking against the pale light. Le Maire followed the shuffle of bodies toward the river. near the old mill, mist clung to the water's edge. A small crowd gathered where the bank sloped steeply. Bernard lay there, on his side, as if he had only fallen asleep against the wet earth. His face was turned slightly toward the river, eyes closed, a streak of mud across his cheek. 2 men whispered that he must have slipped. One woman crossed herself and muttered about guilt. Le Maire crouched, careful not to disturb the wet soil. There was no violence here, no struggle, only surrender. The water had lapped at Bernard's coat but had not taken him. He had come to the edge, and the weight of his shame had finished what the town had begun. The gendarme arrived, breath visible in the morning air. He asked questions in a flat tone, but nobody had answers. "Accident?" he asked. "Maybe," someone said. "Suicide?" Another whispered. The gendarme shrugged, already tired of the discussion. If there's no mark of harm, it's no one's concern but his own. The crowd lingered until Bernard's body was carried to the church hall. His wife followed silently, her face pale and unblinking. She didn't cry, not then. She only held her hands tightly together, as if bracing against a wind that no one else could feel. The bakery stayed closed, of course. By evening, the smell of flour had already begun to fade, replaced by the faint dampness of an abandoned room. Le Maire passed it again, pausing in front of the door. He imagined Bernard sitting at the kitchen table, fingers tapping at a cold cup of coffee, the weight of unspoken things filling the air. He thought about moral pressure, how it began as a whisper and ended as a wall no man could climb. 2 days later, a small funeral was held. Only a few townspeople attended, more out of obligation than affection. Rain threatened, but never fell. The priest read his lines without much variation in his voice. Afterward, Bernard's wife stood alone by the grave while the others drifted back to their routines. Le Maire lingered at a distance, giving her the space of her silence. When she finally spoke, her words floated weakly in the damp air. He didn't deserve this, not from them, not from me. She turned to Le Maire, her face unreadable. "Do you think they'll forget him?" "Yes," he said quietly. "That's how it always goes." By the end of the week, the square had regained its usual rhythm. Children played, doors opened and closed, and a traveller passing through might never guess a man had been erased from this town. Only Le Maire seemed to carry the echo of it. He saw Bernard in the empty bakery, in the curve of the river, in the silence of the café. The town had pressed down until he folded, and then it had simply exhaled and moved on. That night, Le Maire wrote in his notebook, "Collapses and loud, it's a whisper in the dark, a step into still water. The town will sleep well tonight. I wonder if I will." He closed the book and listened to the wind moving softly under the eaves, a sound that felt like the last trace of Bernard passing through. By the time Sunday arrived, the town had already begun to speak of Bernard's death in the past tense, smoothing its edges to make it more comfortable. At the café that morning, the air was warmer than usual, filled with the scent of strong coffee and damp coats drying near the stove. 3 men occupied their usual table, voices low but firm, rehearsing a version of events that required no guilt. "Poor Bernard," one said, stirring his cup. "It was an accident, wet ground, slippery bank. Anyone could have fallen." The second nodded, his spoon clinking against the ceramic. "Yes, tragic but simple. He was going for air after closing the bakery, nothing more." The third man, younger and less convinced, hesitated before adding, "Still." He left that note, didn't he? The first man frowned. A misunderstanding. People write things when they're tired, when they've been working too hard. The inspector said there's no crime here. Best to let it be. Le Maire sat at the counter, silent. His coffee cooled in front of him. He could feel the town repairing itself, like a wound, knitting over too quickly, leaving something trapped beneath the skin. Bernard's widow stayed mostly indoors. Through her kitchen window, one could see her folding laundry, hanging it on the line even in the chill. A woman in the square whispered that she'd already written to her sister in Rouen, asking if she could come stay for the winter. By Tuesday, a notice appeared on the bakery door in a careful, unfamiliar hand. Closed until further notice. Nobody spoke openly about guilt or shame anymore. It was easier to frame it as a tragic accident than to confront what had been done to him in whispers, in silences, in turned backs. The town seemed to agree without discussion. Le Maire visited the bakery steps one morning, standing with his hands in his pockets. The smell of yeast had faded entirely. He imagined Bernard there, scraping dough from his hands, glancing out into the square at people who no longer met his eyes. The detective didn't need to investigate further. He had seen enough. The truth was not a puzzle to be solved, but a weight to be carried. Later, at the post office, the clerk leaned over the counter, speaking in a soft, conspiratorial tone. Tragedy, yes, but no one's to blame. He was fragile. Everyone knew that. Best for his wife to start over somewhere else. Le Maire nodded, but said nothing. He knew the clerk had avoided Bernard's gaze the week before, had turned away when gossip first began to coil through the town like smoke. Yet now he spoke as if absolved, as if forgetting were an act of kindness. That evening, the church bell rang for vespers. Only a handful attended, but the priest included a short prayer for Bernard. His words were precise, scrubbed of ambiguity. We pray for our departed brother who left this world in a moment of misfortune. A moment of misfortune. Nothing more. After the prayer, the congregation shuffled out quietly. In the square, the first signs of market stalls being assembled for the following week's fair appeared, as if life had already made space for something new. One night, Le Maire walked the river path again. The mud had hardened slightly where the body had lain. He crouched, brushing his fingertips against the ground, feeling the faint memory of the collapse. The river gurgled softly, indifferent to the weight it had witnessed. In his mind he could still hear Bernard's final footsteps. Not hurried, not panicked, just a steady rhythm slowing under the burden of shame. He wondered if the man had paused here, looked up at the sky, and realized that the silence of the town had become unbearable. The following day, Le Maire received a letter from the gendarme in charge of the file. It was short and formal. Case closed. Cause of death, accidental fall. No further action required. Le Maire placed it in his drawer next to the small leather notebook where he kept his private reflections. He opened the notebook, added a single line beneath his last entry. They will sleep well. The lie fits like a warm coat. He closed the book gently, as though not to disturb the town's fragile peace. The bakery never reopened. By the end of the month, the windows were covered in paper, and the key had been returned to the landlord. Bernard's wife left quietly one morning with 2 small suitcases and a single trunk. A neighbour watched her lock the door and hand the key to the postmaster, who promised to forward any letters. By noon, the square felt lighter, as if a cloud had lifted. Children ran past where the bakery had been, laughing in the cold air. Adults waved to one another as if nothing lingered behind the glassed-over windows, no one mentioned Bernard anymore. His name seemed to have been folded away with the winter coats. That night, Le Maire sat alone in his small apartment, the lamp casting a weak yellow pool over the table. He heard the wind push against the shutters and the occasional creak of the old building settling. He thought about the town, about how people had traded truth for comfort. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether silence was a form of complicity or a kind of mercy. The case, if it could be called that, had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction but his own. A lie had been chosen, tenderly and deliberately, because the truth would bruise the town in ways it refused to bear. Le Maire leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind. He imagined Bernard's shadow walking the empty streets, pausing at the bakery door, fading into the night that no longer carried his name. In time, the river would wash away the last physical trace, and the town would remain whole. But for Le Maire, the silence had its own sharp edges. Winter settled over Willow Creek like a heavy blanket. The square, once filled with muted chatter and the smell of baking bread, now carried only the sound of wind scraping against shutters. Detective Le Maire had developed a ritual since Bernard's death. Every morning he would leave his small apartment, walk past the boarded-up bakery, and circle the square before stopping at the cafe for a single cup of coffee. He said little, nodding politely at the regulars. By now they treated him with a courteous distance, as though his presence reminded them of something they were trying to forget. Inside, the clinking of cups and low murmur of conversation had returned to normal, yet an invisible gap remained where Bernard's memory lingered. A few glanced toward the bakery without realizing it, like a phantom ache in a limb that was no longer there. One morning, the postmaster joined Le Maire at his table. He was a short, balding man who smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. "You're quiet these days, Inspector," he said, trying for a smile. Le Maire stirred his coffee slowly. "There isn't much to say." The postmaster shifted in his chair. "I suppose not. Life goes on." He hesitated, glancing toward the bakery's empty windows. "People need to move forward, you understand?" Le Maire nodded. He understood perfectly. The postmaster wanted his agreement, his official confirmation that nothing more should be thought or spoken about Bernard's death. "Did his wife leave a forwarding address?" Le Maire asked. The man's expression flickered. "She asked for her mail to be sent to her sister in Rouen. Beyond that, nothing." He paused, lowering his voice. "She didn't even come to say goodbye." "She said goodbye," Le Maire replied quietly. "Just not with words." The postmaster shifted again, uncomfortable. "Well, I suppose it's for the best. Best to leave the past behind." Le Maire didn't respond. He let the words hang between them like smoke, dissipating slowly. In the afternoons, Le Maire walked the river path. The days were shorter now, the light fading before supper. He would pause where Bernard's body had been found, listening to the muted rush of the current and the faint rustle of trees, stripped bare by winter. Sometimes he crouched to study the ground, though the mud had hardened into rough earth and most traces of the incident were gone. He tried to imagine what Bernard had felt in those final moments. Not fear, he thought, but resignation. A soft, exhausted surrender to the cold and the dark. The detective wondered if he was the last person left in the town, still thinking about him, still carrying the quiet weight of the truth. A week after the funeral, Le Maire was invited to dinner by the mayor. The invitation was not personal but ceremonial, a gesture to close the matter. The mayor's house was warm and bright, the tables set with roast chicken and wine. Only 3 other guests attended: the schoolteacher, the pharmacist, and the mayor's wife. They spoke in polite, careful tones, circling around the subject without touching it. Eventually, the mayor cleared his throat. "I want to thank you, Inspector," he said. "You've handled this with great discretion. It hasn't been easy for the town, but we'll recover." Le Maire regarded him over the rim of his glass. "You're certain the town has recovered?" The mayor hesitated. "In time, yes. People need to believe in simple stories. Tragedy is easier to accept than other possibilities." Le Maire let the words settle. The warmth of the room pressed in on him, almost suffocating. He could feel the unspoken agreement at the table. Bernard's death would remain an accident. Any other version of events would be quietly buried with him. As he walked home, later through the frozen streets, Le Maire felt the sharp bite of cold air. The stars above the square were faint, blurred by the glow of a single lamp-post. He paused outside the bakery again. Through the papered windows he imagined the shape of the oven, the counters, the shelves where loaves had once cooled. He thought of the morning Bernard had come out to sweep the steps, only to be met by averted eyes. The truth was simple, he realized. The town had killed him, not with hands, but with silence and shame. And now it wanted to sleep soundly. Days became a pattern of quiet observation. Le Maire wrote nothing official about his suspicions. He filed the gendarme's letter, closed the notebook in which he had recorded his private reflections, and placed it back into his drawer. Sometimes he thought of writing a final report, the one that would name no names, but would tell the truth about complicity, about how shame can bleed a man dry in full view of his neighbors. But he never did. He imagined the mayor reading it, frowning, setting it aside as speculation. He imagined the townspeople whispering that the inspector had grown sentimental, that he had let a simple case become too heavy for him. No, he thought, the truth served no purpose now. It would only reopen wounds that no one wanted to acknowledge. So Le Maire's silence became his decision, as deliberate as Bernard's final walk to the river. One evening, he sat by his window watching the square. Snow began to fall lightly, softening the edges of the buildings and covering the cobblestones. In that moment, the town looked almost innocent, as if winter itself had absolved it. Le Maire thought of Bernard's shadow again, moving quietly through the streets, unseen but present. He felt a heaviness in his chest that was not quite sorrow and not quite anger. Something quieter, like resignation. He whispered to the empty room, "I won't speak." The snow continued to fall, erasing the last trace of the path that led to the river. Spring arrived in Willow Creek quietly, as though nothing had ever happened. The snow melted first from the square, revealing the cobblestones beneath, damp and uneven. The river thawed, its surface rippling in muted light. Shoots of grass emerged by the footbridge where Bernard's body had once been found, as if nature itself had decided to erase the memory of winter and of him. Detective Le Maire noticed how quickly the town leaned into forgetting. Windows were polished, flower boxes reappeared on sills, and the bakery was finally put up for sale. The papered windows were replaced with a bright sign, "For lease, inquire at Town Hall." No one spoke Bernard's name anymore. Not in the cafe, not in the market, not even in hushed conversations at the post office. It was as though the town had collectively inhaled and held its breath until the memory dissolved. One morning, Le Maire stood outside the empty bakery. He had his hands in the pockets of his overcoat, his hat tilted forward against a weak sun. The air carried the scent of damp earth and distant chimney smoke. Across the street, Madame Villon, the seamstress who had once whispered rumours about Bernard's debts, was hanging out laundry. She caught his eye for a brief second, then looked away. The movement was subtle, but Le Maire recognized it. Avoidance had become the town's language. A new family would likely rent the bakery soon. They would arrive with hope, believing Willow Creek to be a peaceful little place, unaware of the quiet suffocation that lingered beneath its charm. Life settled into routines. In the mornings, Le Maire bought his bread from the neighbouring village, walking the extra distance without complaint. In the afternoons, he took slow walks along the river, sometimes stopping to watch the water move past the place where Bernard had died. He noticed the changes in the townspeople as the weeks passed. The postmaster laughed louder than before. The cafe owner painted her shutters a cheerful blue. Children ran across the square without their parents calling them back. But beneath that return to normalcy, Le Maire sensed a different kind of silence. Not grief, but relief. The town had expelled its ghost and could now carry on as though nothing had ever been wrong. One Sunday, he attended the market. The square was lively with voices, the smell of onions and fresh bread filling the air. He saw neighbours exchanging smiles and recipes, leaning over stalls with the comfort of routine. He passed by the fishmonger's table and overheard a woman saying, "It feels like last year never happened, doesn't it?" Her companion nodded. Best that way. Best to leave shadows in the past. They didn't notice Le Maire listening. Or perhaps they did, and simply didn't care. For the first time, he realized that his presence no longer carried the weight it once did. The townspeople were no longer worried about the detective who might uncover secrets. The secret had already been buried with Bernard, and Le Maire, in his silence, had buried himself alongside it. The invitations stopped coming. The mayor no longer summoned him for quiet suppers. Neighbours waved politely, but didn't linger in conversation. Le Maire had become a figure who belonged to the winter that everyone had agreed to forget. He spent his evenings alone in his apartment above the shoemaker's shop, the faint smell of leather and glue drifting up through the floorboards. His window overlooked the square. Some nights he would sit by the glass and watch the street lamps glow against the empty cobblestones. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was something quieter, a sense of being unnecessary, of drifting outside the rhythm of the town's life. In April, he received a letter from the regional office asking if he would like to transfer to a busier district. He held the paper for a long time before folding it and placing it in his drawer beside his unwritten report. Leaving would mean escaping the weight of the unspoken, but it would also mean abandoning the quiet watch he kept over the memory of what had truly happened. No one else seemed to carry it anymore. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the rooftops, Le Maire walked to the river again. He stood on the small wooden bridge, hands resting on the rail. The water reflected streaks of fading pink and grey. He thought of Bernard's last walk. The careful steps along the embankment, the cold air against his face, the weight of the town's judgment pressing down until it became unbearable. Le Maire closed his eyes and listened to the river. It had returned to its natural rhythm, indifferent to the lives that had touched it. Behind him, a pair of children laughed, tossing pebbles into the shallows. Their voices were bright, unburdened, already part of a future that had no room for the past. By early summer, the bakery had new tenants. A young couple from Rouen had taken the lease. They painted the shutters white and put a chalkboard sign outside with the words, grand opening soon. The first morning, the scent of fresh bread drifted across the square again. Le Maire felt a strange mix of warmth and unease. The town would fill with life, the memory of Bernard buried beneath the fragrance of warm loaves. He watched from the cafe as neighbors congratulated the new bakers. Smiles were genuine, voices cheerful. The square seemed to have grown lighter, as though the river and the winter and Bernard's silent walk had been nothing but a passing dream. No one would speak of it again. At night, Le Maire wrote in his private notebook for the first time in weeks. The town has healed, but only because it has agreed to be dishonest with itself. Bernard exists now only in the quiet places, the river, the bridge, and in me. He closed the book and placed it back in the drawer, where it joined the unfiled report and the transfer letter. Through the window he could see the square glowing under the lamplight. A faint breeze carried the scent of bread, masking the memory of cold water and wet earth. He realized with a heavy calm that the aftermath of tragedy is not noise or mourning. It is the softest silence, the kind that can make a man disappear twice. Years slipped through Willow Creek like the river's current, quietly, without resistance. The town grew brighter, cleaner, more forgetful. Tourists sometimes arrived in spring, walking along the embankment, pausing on the wooden bridge to take photographs. They saw only the quaint shutters, the flower boxes, and the slow charm of a place that had never known trouble. Bernard's name never passed anyone's lips. The bakery had changed hands twice. Children who once tossed pebbles into the shallows had grown into young adults, their memories polished smooth like stones in the riverbed. Detective Le Maire, older now, slower, no longer walked the square every morning. He had retired quietly, staying in the same small apartment above the shoemaker's shop. His hair had thinned, his back had bent, and he had become a familiar but largely invisible figure. People greeted him politely the way one greets a piece of the town itself. In all those years he had kept the unspoken truth folded inside him, like a letter he would never send. It was a late autumn afternoon when a stranger knocked on his door. The woman was in her 30s, wrapped in a dark green coat, her gloves dusted with the faint mist of the river. Her voice carried the hesitant politeness of someone crossing into another person's private world. "Are you Monsieur Le Maire?" "Yes," he said, leaning against the frame. His voice had softened over the years. "I'm sorry to disturb you. My name is Elise Bernard." He froze, his hand tightening slightly on the doorframe. He had known Bernard's son had left for Paris, but he hadn't heard of a daughter. Perhaps she was a niece. Perhaps it didn't matter. Her eyes, grey, sharp, with something unresolved, told him why she had come. She hesitated before speaking again. "I've come to see where my uncle died. My family never really spoke about it. My father said it was an accident, but I've always wondered if it was." The hallway behind Le Maire seemed suddenly too small, too quiet. He stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. They sat at the small wooden table in his kitchen. The kettle hissed softly. Through the window the square lay nearly empty, the light of late afternoon casting long shadows over the cobblestones. "I've read the official report," she said. Her gloved hands folded tightly on the table. "They said he must have slipped, maybe in the dark, but I can't stop thinking there was more to it. That he wasn't the kind of man to just fall." Le Maire studied her for a long moment. He noticed the way she barely touched the tea he'd poured, her gaze fixed on the window rather than him. She carried the same quiet restlessness he had seen in the townspeople years ago, the weight of something unsaid pressing against the edges of her composure. "People slip," he said finally, "especially when the night is cold and the ground is uneven." She glanced at him sharply. "Do you believe that?" Lemaire didn't answer right away. He felt the familiar tug of memory, the winter river, the bakery, windows dark, the whispered gossip curling like smoke in the square. He saw Bernard walking slowly along the embankment, alone with the knowledge that the town had already turned its back on him. Elise's voice softened. "I just want to know if he suffered, if he was alone." The river that evening seemed alive in his memory. He could hear it, even in the stillness of the room. "No one saw him fall," Lemaire said at last, "but I believe he knew the town had left him behind, and I believe he was very tired." She nodded slowly, her throat moving as she swallowed unspoken questions. "So, it wasn't an accident, was it?" Lemaire didn't confirm, didn't deny. Instead, he looked past her to the square, where a boy was chasing a ball that bounced off the stone steps of the church. Life had continued without hesitation. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "a man disappears long before he is gone. People stop seeing him. They look past him. By the time he's truly missing, it feels natural." Elise's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She removed her gloves slowly, one finger at a time, as though the movement grounded her. "Thank you," she whispered. He watched her stand and button her coat. He didn't follow her to the door immediately. He listened to her footsteps in the hall, each one echoing against the quiet walls like the fading trace of a confession. And that evening, Lemaire walked to the river for the first time in months. The wind was cold, carrying the smell of wet leaves. The water moved steadily under the bridge, reflecting the faint glow of the street lamps. He rested his hands on the wooden railing, the same as he had years ago, and thought about all the lives that had passed through Willow Creek. So many of them had chosen silence as their shield. He thought of Bernard. Not the man who disappeared, but the man who had once smiled behind the bakery counter, flour dusting his hands. A man whose life had been small, unremarkable, and yet too heavy to bear under the gaze of a town that could only forgive by forgetting. Lemaire never told Elise the full truth. He never told her that Bernard had been quietly accused, that shame had curled itself around him until it became a rope. He never explained that he had chosen silence over justice, not because he couldn't act, but because he understood the weight of shame better than the weight of law. Instead, he left her with enough to carry, and nothing more. Years later, after Lemaire's own death, the townspeople would clear his apartment. Among his few possessions, they found a small notebook in the drawer beside an unopened transfer letter. The final page held a single line, written in his careful hand. "The river keeps its secrets, but the town lives by forgetting them." No one in Willow Creek spoke of Bernard again. The river flowed on, as it always had, carrying the reflection of a quiet town that no longer remembered the man who had once disappeared along its banks. And, in that forgetting, Willow Creek found its peace.